On the morning of Sunday, November 5, 2017, the town of Milledgeville, Georgia, stirred awake under a soft, overcast sky. The streets remained quiet except for the steady arrival of vehicles in the gravel parking lot of Holy Word Baptist Church. Inside the modest brick structure, preparations for the weekly service were in full swing. Wooden pews, polished just the day before, filled gradually with familiar faces. Hymnals rested in neat rows, and the scent of wax and faint perfume lingered in the air. At precisely 10 a.m., Pastor Harold Mays stepped to the pulpit, dressed in a charcoal gray suit and a navy tie with silver pinstripes. His voice, calm and measured, filled the sanctuary as he welcomed the congregation and offered the opening prayer. A respected figure in the community, Pastor Mays had served the church for over 15 years. Known for his composed demeanor and structured sermons, he was often described as a man of quiet authority, someone who listened more than he spoke, and who preached less from emotion than from Scripture. The choir, led by Sister Dolores Jennings, performed 2 spirituals before Harold returned to the pulpit. His sermon that morning centered on honesty, integrity, and the burden of secrets. He quoted Proverbs and Luke, emphasizing the idea that what is hidden would be revealed, and that the heart must remain open to God's light. Several members of the congregation later recalled that the sermon felt unusually pointed, as if directed inward rather than outward. At the time, it passed without question. Among those in attendance was Lamont Scott, an 18-year-old man who had been an active member of the church since his teenage years. Lamont was known for his dedication to the church's youth programs and his position as a tenor in the choir. He often lingered after services, helping to tidy up, restock pamphlets, or chat with fellow parishioners. On that day, he sat near the 3rd row on the right side, hands folded, listening intently. As the final hymn faded and the congregation began to disperse, Harold descended from the pulpit and made his way to the lobby, where he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries with departing members. He moved deliberately, maintaining eye contact and offering brief, reassuring nods. When asked about his plans for the afternoon, he mentioned needing to check on a family member in the county and then take time for rest. By 12:30 p.m., most of the church was empty. Lamont was last seen walking alongside Harold as they exited through the side door of the building. Outside, the weather remained mild. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows over the parking lot. Harold unlocked his white SUV, placed his leather-bound Bible and notes on the passenger seat, and sat for several moments before driving away. His vehicle was observed turning onto the main road and heading west out of town. Lamont never returned home that evening. When he failed to answer his mother's calls or show up for his Monday morning shift at the Milledgeville Public Library, concern quickly turned to alarm. By late afternoon, a missing person report was filed with the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department. Deputies initiated the standard missing adult protocol, reviewing his known contacts, recent movements, and last confirmed whereabouts. Interviews conducted over the next 48 hours confirmed that Lamont had been present at Holy Word Baptist Church that Sunday, and that he had been seen in conversation with Pastor Mays after the service. Several parishioners remembered seeing the 2 men walk out together, though none recalled where they went or whether they departed in the same vehicle. Security cameras at the church offered no assistance, though 2 were mounted near the main entrance. Neither was functional at the time. Investigators began searching for Lamont's vehicle, a dark green 2002 Toyota Camry, registered in his name. The car was not at his residence, nor was it located at the church. It did not appear on any traffic cameras or toll booth recordings in the surrounding counties. Calls to his cell phone went directly to voicemail. His financial accounts showed no activity after November 5. Friends described Lamont as dependable and predictable, someone who always informed his mother if he would be out late or traveling. He had no history of disappearing, and no known enemies. Within a week, flyers bearing Lamont's photograph appeared on storefronts, community boards, and gas stations throughout Milledgeville. A candlelight vigil was organized outside the library where he worked. Pastor Mays gave a short prayer at the event, urging hope and patience. He spoke of Lamont's kindness, his commitment to the community, and the power of collective faith. His words were steady, measured, and devoid of emotion. Behind closed doors, however, suspicion had begun to take root. A few congregants found it odd that Harold had been so composed, even distant. Some whispered about how often Lamont had visited the church office during off hours, or how frequently he and the pastor were seen speaking in hushed tones. These were speculations, grounded more in unease than fact. Still, in a town as small as Milledgeville, even the faintest hint of scandal could spread quickly. Law enforcement, lacking hard evidence, refrained from drawing conclusions. There was no indication of foul play at Lamont's home or in his personal belongings. His phone records were sparse, revealing only a handful of text messages on the morning of the disappearance, none of which appeared suspicious. His social media activity had gone silent. Digital forensic analysis offered little to go on. As the days passed, the search became increasingly desperate. Police scoured wooded areas on the outskirts of town. Volunteers combed rural trails, ditches, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned tree canopies, while dogs traced scents that led nowhere. All efforts ended in frustration. The forest swallowed secrets with indifference. By the end of November, the case had gone cold. The posters faded under rain and sun. The vigils ended. The town returned to routine, carrying a silent absence in its rhythm. The name Lamont Scott remained on a few lips, mostly spoken in hushed tones, as if the full truth would be too heavy to say aloud. And at Holy Word Baptist Church, the sermons continued. Pastor Mays stood at the pulpit each Sunday, speaking of redemption, silence, and the trials of faith. He smiled when necessary, bowed his head in prayer, and closed each service with the same benediction. Amen. On the morning of November 12, 2017, a local hunter named Dennis Harwood ventured deep into the forested area of Oconee National Forest, just outside Milledgeville, Georgia. He had taken the old logging road near Pine Hollow Trail, a rarely used path that twisted and narrowed as it wove through dense undergrowth and patches of pine. The weather was crisp, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. Harwood moved slowly, scanning the terrain for deer movement, his boots crunching underfoot as he advanced deeper into the woods than usual. Around 9:20 a.m., he caught a glimpse of something unusual through the trees, a glint of metallic paint, partially obscured by branches and debris. As he approached cautiously, it became clear that a vehicle had been abandoned off the side of the narrow path, its frame nestled awkwardly between saplings and bramble. The car, a dark green Toyota Camry, was coated in a thin film of pollen and grime. Its windows were streaked with condensation. Dead leaves had gathered in piles along the windshield and hood. It looked as though it had been there for days, maybe longer. What immediately struck Harwood was the unnatural stillness around the vehicle. No movement. No sound. A faint, sour odor floated in the cold air, subtle but unmistakable. The driver's side window was rolled up, but the backseat window on the passenger side was cracked slightly open. The interior was dim, and the windshield was fogged from the inside. Dennis circled the car, noting the absence of visible license plates and the deep tire impressions behind the vehicle that led off the road. The front doors were locked, but the back passenger side door had not been fully closed. With the tip of his rifle, Harwood nudged the handle. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of odor far stronger than before. Inside, the shape of a body lay slumped on the rear seat, partially covered with a worn canvas jacket. The legs were bent unnaturally, and the head rested against the window. The skin was mottled. There were dark patches visible around the neck and jaw. Harwood stepped back immediately and dialed 911. Within an hour, deputies from the Baldwin County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene, accompanied by a forensic response unit. The area was cordoned off with crime scene tape, and a perimeter was established. Investigators approached the vehicle with care. A series of photographs were taken before any movement occurred. The victim's body was removed with great caution and placed into a body bag for transport to the medical examiner's office. Preliminary observations suggested the deceased had been dead for at least a week. There were no signs of immediate trauma visible from the exterior, but discoloration around the neck area hinted at possible strangulation. The victim was male, dressed in dark jeans and a black t-shirt. There were no forms of identification on the body. The wallet, phone, and keys were missing. However, in the front cup holder, technicians found an empty styrofoam coffee cup with a faded gas station logo and a timestamp dated November 5th. The VIN number etched into the base of the windshield and matched to state vehicle records identified the car as belonging to Lamont Scott, the missing man last seen after Sunday service at Holy Word Baptist Church. Confirmation was swift. Dental records were reviewed, and fingerprints matched those on file from Lamont's previous employment at the city library. The missing persons case had just become a homicide investigation. News of the discovery broke quietly at first. Local police issued a statement confirming that a body had been found and that foul play was suspected, but the identity was withheld for 24 hours pending notification of next of kin. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators began assembling a timeline. The location of the vehicle raised questions. The logging road was not accessible by accident, nor was it commonly used by residents. Whoever left the car there had done so with intent. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated signs of asphyxiation. Petechiae were observed in the eyes and facial tissue, and bruising patterns along the neck were consistent with manual strangulation. Toxicology results were still pending, but there were no obvious signs of drugs or alcohol at the scene. No defensive wounds were immediately noted, suggesting the victim had not fought back or had been caught by surprise. The body's positioning indicated it had been moved post-mortem. Meanwhile, crime scene analysts combed the vehicle for trace evidence. Fibers were collected from the back seat and the passenger side floor mat. A faint shoe print on the rear interior door panel was photographed and preserved. Luminol tests were performed inside the trunk, which showed no significant blood presence. The only physical item found in the car that might connect to a suspect was a single partial fingerprint smudged on the rear passenger window, too incomplete to match directly, but viable for comparison. Attention shifted back to the people closest to Lamont, especially those who had last seen him. The church, once a place of refuge and spiritual guidance, now stood under an unspoken cloud. Questions emerged. Who did Lamont leave the church with? Who had access to his car? And why would his body end up in a place so remote, a place only someone local would know how to reach? Detectives revisited the congregation, not as worshippers, but as witnesses. And they would soon begin looking more closely at the man who had given the sermon that morning. The man who had spoken about hidden truths. The man who had stood before them in a crisp suit, preaching silence wrapped in righteousness. The forest had given back a secret. And the silence after Amen was about to unravel. In the days following the discovery of Lamont Scott's body, the atmosphere in Milledgeville began to shift. What had once been a tragedy wrapped in uncertainty was now transforming into something darker, an open wound that oozed suspicion and quiet outrage. Rumors, once contained to hushed living room conversations and phone calls among neighbors, started seeping into public spaces. Coffee shops, church foyers, and barber shops became stages for speculative reenactments, half-truths, and shared glances. The sense of unease was no longer about the loss of a beloved member of the community, it was about what that loss revealed. Holy Word Baptist Church, which had stood as a beacon of structure and spiritual routine for nearly 2 decades, now stood in the center of a swirling storm. The church's members, some defensive and others unnerved, found themselves under the eye of both law enforcement and their own consciences. Attendance dropped. Pews that once held extended families sat half empty. Those who did come no longer lingered. They listened, stood, and left quickly. The fellowship hall, usually alive with chatter and coffee after service, remained silent. At the center of many of the whispered theories stood Pastor Harold Mays. His name, once spoken with reverence, had taken on a different tone. People recalled small details that previously meant nothing, how Lamont and the pastor were often the last to leave, how Harold sometimes closed his office door when Lamont stopped by, how their conversations occasionally seemed tense or overly private. Some claimed to have seen them drive off together on past Sundays. Others recalled the way Lamont had recently looked distracted, even nervous, in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. None of these observations were evidence, but they began to build a narrative in the public's mind. Even those loyal to Harold found themselves caught between faith and growing doubt. The sense that something had been going on, something not right, began to harden into conviction. Law enforcement, sensing the undercurrent, returned to Holy Word Baptist Church to conduct follow-up interviews. They spoke again with parishioners, asking about routines, relationships, and anything that might place Lamont with Harold on the afternoon of November 5th. Some congregants were cooperative, others became defensive. A few admitted that they had always wondered about the pastor's private life. He had never been married, never mentioned any relationships, and lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. His life outside the church was a mystery to most, and now that mystery took on a new shape. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Pastor May's home. It was a small, well-kept single-story residence with a neat lawn and white curtains in every window. Inside, the house was clean, orderly, and impersonal. There were no family photos, no signs of visitors, and no personal clutter. But in the study, behind a stack of theological texts and folders labeled with sermon dates, officers discovered a locked desk drawer. Inside was a prepaid cell phone, separate from the one Harold had submitted during initial questioning. The device, once unlocked by digital forensics, revealed a series of text exchanges with a contact saved only as L. The messages were brief but suggestive, references to meetings, secrecy, and what appeared to be emotional tension. One particular message, sent 2 days before Lamont's disappearance, read, "We can't keep doing this. Someone will find out." Another, sent the evening before his last service, simply read, "Tomorrow. After church." Investigators cross-referenced the timestamps with phone tower data. Both Harold's personal and the burner phone had pinged in the vicinity of the forest near Pine Hollow Trail on the afternoon of November 5th. The implications were clear, and the contradictions with his original statement to police about visiting a sick relative that day were impossible to ignore. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the picture was sharpening. A hidden relationship. A clandestine meeting. A secluded location. A body left in a forest. Back at the church, the growing scrutiny became unbearable. The church board convened an emergency session and asked Pastor Mays to take an indefinite leave of absence. He agreed without protest. His sermon ceased. His presence vanished from the pulpit. But his absence did not silence the questions. More former members came forward, some offering vague but suggestive accounts of Lamont expressing anxiety, feelings of entrapment, and a need to make a decision. No one could say for sure what Lamont had planned, but more than one person recalled that he had been growing distant, as if struggling with something that weighed heavily on him. Public pressure mounted. Social media posts circulated theories and accusations. Regional news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a possible scandal within a religious institution. The narrative had shifted from mystery to motive, from questions to blame. And through it all, Harold Mays remained silent, his home dark at night, his windows closed, his phone unanswered. The investigation, once methodical and open-ended, now narrowed its scope. The case was no longer about a missing man. It was about a man found, and the man who may have put him there. The whispers had grown into something louder than sermons. The town no longer needed a verdict to feel betrayed. The weight of implication hung in the air, and no one would breathe easy until justice had a name. In the second week of December 2017, the investigation into Lamont Scott's death entered a new and decisive phase. The evidence collected so far had created a web of suspicion, centering tightly around Pastor Harold Mays. The burner phone found in his home, the text messages suggesting a secret relationship, the contradicting timelines, and the overlapping cell tower data were enough to justify deeper scrutiny. Still, investigators lacked one thing, a definitive physical connection between Harold and the scene where Lamont's body had been discovered. With a new search warrant in hand, forensic teams returned to Harold Mays' residence. This time, they brought advanced equipment and a broader mandate. Every inch of the home was examined, every drawer emptied, every floorboard tapped. They paid particular attention to the garage, a detached structure with a concrete floor and a single fluorescent bulb that flickered when switched on. At first glance, the garage appeared clean, sparsely used, and devoid of anything unusual. But on the far wall, behind stacked boxes of unused church brochures and seasonal decorations, officers noticed a large rubber mat pressed tightly against the drywall. When it was removed, a faint stain became visible beneath it, a discolored area near the baseboard. Luminol testing revealed blood traces that had been partially cleaned, but not completely eradicated. The splatter pattern was subtle, suggesting that the site had been wiped down in haste. Samples were collected and sent for DNA comparison. Further inspection uncovered a folded canvas tarp with small reddish-brown smudges hidden beneath the workbench. One corner of the tarp had a broken metal grommet, bent inward, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. Meanwhile, inside the house, a low-profile cabinet under the hallway floor vent concealed another piece of the puzzle. It contained a locked box, an old, dented metal container with a combination dial and no identifying markings. After securing it and transporting it to the lab, forensic analysts were able to bypass the lock and examine its contents. Inside were several personal items, 2 USB flash drives, a stack of printed photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The photographs depicted Harold and Lamont in various settings. Some were innocuous, showing them at church events or standing near a parked car. But others were far more personal. Taken indoors, in dim lighting, they showed the men embracing, seated closely on a couch, and in one case, lying side by side. These photos had timestamps that spanned the course of over a year. They had clearly been taken in private, most likely by Harold himself. One photo was printed and folded separately, as if kept closer or revisited often. The journal, written in neat cursive, did not include dates, but the entries formed a chronological narrative. The earliest pages expressed spiritual conflict and internal turmoil, descriptions of the closeness I cannot name and a bond that feels sacred but damned. As the entries progressed, the tone shifted from introspection to anxiety. Later pages described conversations about exposure and his growing fear of the truth getting out. One passage stood out starkly. He said he was going to tell someone. That he couldn't live like this anymore. I told him that would ruin everything. Another, written with jagged pen strokes and underlined twice, read, I couldn't let him destroy the life I've built. God forgive me. The contents of the journal were reviewed by prosecutors and investigators alike. Though not a legal confession in the conventional sense, the writings established emotional context, potential motive, and premeditation. Combined with the photographs and physical evidence in the garage, the journal painted a vivid picture of a relationship marked by secrecy, shame, and escalating tension. Harold Mays had lived a double life, one of public reverence and private fear. And that fear, it now appeared, may have led to violence. While lab results on the blood confirmed it to be a match with Lamont Scott's DNA, the discovery of 2 fingerprints on the inner lid of the metal box tied it directly to Harold. There was no longer any plausible argument that he had been unaware of these materials. The flash drives contained additional documents, sermon drafts, correspondence, and one video file labeled Testament. The video, just under 6 minutes in length, was a shaky recording of Harold speaking into a camera in a darkened room. He spoke of temptation, of walking a crooked path, and of wounds that will not heal. He never mentioned Lamont by name, but the implication was unmistakable. Law enforcement officials now had the emotional confession, the physical evidence, and the contextual motive they had been searching for. With all components aligned, they moved quickly. On December 14th, Harold Mays was arrested at his home without incident. He was taken into custody and booked at the Baldwin County Jail. He declined to make a statement and requested legal counsel. Bail was denied pending formal charges. The journal and video were entered into the court record under sealed evidence. The church, already fractured by scandal, announced it would suspend services indefinitely. Members left in silence, some still unwilling to accept what was unfolding, others quietly relieved that the truth, long buried beneath layers of image and expectation, had finally begun to surface. The confession hadn't come in a courtroom or during questioning. It had been written behind closed doors, locked away beneath vents and silence. A hidden truth documented in ink and secrecy, waiting for someone to uncover it. Now, with each revealed page, the story was no longer one of loss, but of deliberate erasure. The faith once spoken into microphones had turned inward, into a monologue of guilt. And the man who had so often asked others to confess their sins had, at last, left behind his own. In April 2018, nearly 5 months after the arrest of Pastor Harold Mays, the trial began in the Baldwin County Superior Court under heightened public attention. The case had gripped the small Georgia town of Milledgeville, not only because of the brutal nature of Lamont Scott's death, but also due to the identity of the accused, a man once regarded as a moral compass and spiritual pillar in the community. The courtroom was filled on the first day. Spectators lined the pews, journalists scribbled in notebooks, and a handful of church members sat silently in the back, eyes forward, hands folded. Harold entered the courtroom in a charcoal suit, his demeanor calm and reserved, as though preparing to deliver a sermon rather than stand trial. His defense team consisted of 2 attorneys, both experienced in high-profile cases. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Carla Newell, prepared a methodical and carefully constructed case. They had no eyewitnesses to the crime itself, no direct confession, and no murder weapon. But they had something equally powerful, a mosaic of circumstantial evidence, forensic data, and a deeply unsettling psychological narrative. The prosecution opened by outlining the relationship between Harold Mays and Lamont Scott, presenting it as a secret connection fraught with emotional pressure and shame. They did not attempt to sensationalize the nature of the relationship but instead focused on its concealment and the mounting stress it placed on both parties. A timeline was introduced showing consistent communication between the 2 men, private meetings, and ultimately, a message exchange suggesting a planned confrontation after the Sunday service on November 5th. The jury was shown images recovered from Harold's home, printed photographs depicting moments of physical closeness, including one where the 2 men appeared to be lying together on a sofa. Each photograph was dated, and one was marked with a handwritten note on the reverse, "Our Sanctuary." The journal found in Harold's study was introduced into evidence, with selected entries read aloud in court. Phrases such as "he said he would tell" and "I couldn't let it happen" were emphasized to illustrate motive and emotional state. Crime scene analysts testified about the presence of Lamont's blood in Harold's garage, detailing the luminol results, the collection of fibers from the canvas tarp, and the faint outline of a handprint found on the concrete floor. The blood DNA matched Lamont's. The tire impressions near the site where Lamont's body was discovered matched the make and model of Harold's vehicle, which had been cleaned thoroughly after the day of the disappearance. Surveillance footage from a local gas station also placed Harold's SUV traveling in the direction of Oconee National Forest on the afternoon in question. The emotional crux of the prosecution's case came with the presentation of the video file labeled Testament. The jury watched in silence as the dim, shaky footage played. In it, Harold sat before a camera, speaking about failure, temptation, and crossing a line that no man of God should cross. Though he did not name Lamont or explicitly confess to the murder, the implied connection was unmistakable. It was a moment of spiritual reckoning, preserved on video, and now laid bare in a courtroom. The defense countered by attacking the lack of direct evidence. They argued that the journal reflected internal struggle, not admission of guilt. They claimed the photos and texts showed a consensual relationship that had ended badly but not fatally. They challenged the blood evidence in the garage, suggesting alternate contamination sources, and argued that the video was a metaphorical confession, not an incriminating one. Their narrative positioned Harold as a man broken by private shame and grief, not as a murderer. They brought forward character witnesses, church members, former colleagues, and family acquaintances, all of whom described Harold as compassionate, disciplined, and incapable of violence. Several claimed that the public had rushed to judgment, turning against him without fully understanding the context. Others testified to Harold's anguish in the weeks following Lamont's disappearance, citing visible stress and emotional withdrawal. The defense aimed to portray Harold as a tragic figure, undone by fear and circumstance, but not guilt. Despite these efforts, the cumulative weight of the evidence, physical, digital, and emotional, proved difficult to overcome. Jurors watched hours of forensic testimony, reviewed communications, and listened to the slow unraveling of a man who had once appeared unshakable. The prosecution emphasized that while there was no singular piece of evidence pointing to Harold as the killer, the collective impact of the findings led to one conclusion. He had motive, opportunity, and knowledge of where the body would never be found, until it was. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 full days of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Harold Mays was found guilty of second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom remained still as the judge read the decision. Harold showed no outward emotion. He stood, hands clasped, looking straight ahead. The sentencing was scheduled for the following month. As the bailiff led Harold out of the courtroom, a few church members wept softly. Others turned their faces away. For the town of Milledgeville, the verdict marked the end of a long, painful reckoning. The man who had once stood at the pulpit, delivering sermons of righteousness, had now been judged by a different kind of congregation. And outside the courthouse, the community began to speak openly again, not in whispers, but in full sentences. The trial had answered many questions, but it had also exposed deeper wounds. Wounds about trust, silence, and the cost of hiding who one really is. Harold's fall from grace had not just brought justice, it had shattered a mirror that many were still struggling to look into. On May 21, 2018, the sentencing hearing for Harold Mays took place in Baldwin County Superior Court. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial, but the air remained heavy with expectation. Those in attendance included family members of Lamont Scott, several local journalists, and a few former parishioners who had chosen to witness the final chapter of a story that had torn through their faith and community. Harold sat at the defense table, wearing the same still expression he had carried throughout the proceedings. There were no tears, no dramatic gestures, only silence as he waited for the judge to speak. Judge Evelyn Norwood, known for her measured and composed demeanor, reviewed the facts before issuing the sentence. She spoke of betrayal, not just of a single person, but of an entire congregation. She described Harold's actions as a calculated abuse of trust, shaped by years of moral authority and spiritual influence. The court, she explained, had weighed the absence of a direct confession against the overwhelming circumstantial and forensic evidence. In the eyes of the law, and in the judgment of the jury, Harold Mays was responsible for the death of Lamont Scott. The sentence was delivered without flourish, 30 years in state prison for second-degree murder, with an additional 5 years for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice, to be served consecutively. Harold would not be eligible for parole until he had served at least 25 years. As the judge concluded her remarks, she offered no words of comfort, no invocation of grace. She simply closed the file and called for the next case. Harold was led away in handcuffs, his figure slowly disappearing behind the secured courtroom door. He did not look back. Outside the courthouse, the Scott family stood together in silence before issuing a brief written statement to the press. It expressed gratitude to law enforcement, the prosecution, and the community members who supported them. It made no mention of Harold by name. The tone was solemn and restrained. There were no declarations of closure, only an acknowledgement of pain and the hope that, in time, healing might begin. In the months that followed, the town of Milledgeville struggled to reconcile the image of the man who had once stood behind the pulpit with the man now confined to a prison cell. The church building where Harold had preached remained vacant. The doors were locked, the sign out front faded by weather and time. Weeds crept across the parking lot. A place once filled with hymns and sermons had become a hollow shell, its echoes now filled with unease rather than hope. Attempts were made to revitalize the congregation under new leadership, but few showed interest in returning. The building was eventually sold to a non-denominational ministry from another county. A new name was painted over the old one, but the past clung to the walls like dust that refused to lift. For many in the community, the wound left behind by the scandal had never closed, it had simply become a scar they learned to live with. Lamont Scott was buried in a quiet ceremony attended by family, friends, and a few former co-workers from the Milledgeville Public Library. His mother, who had once clung to every sliver of hope, now stood quietly beneath the soft branches of a magnolia tree, watching as her son's casket was lowered into the ground. There were no television cameras, no crowds. Just a small group gathered in grief, offering their final goodbyes. A polished headstone was later installed, engraved with Lamont's name, his birth and death dates, and a single line chosen by his mother. He sang in silence, and the silence heard him. Back inside the prison in Reidsville, Georgia, Harold Mays began his sentence in the general population of a medium-security unit. He remained withdrawn, speaking only when required, keeping mostly to himself during meals and chapel services. Those who worked at the facility described him as polite, well-behaved, and remarkably composed. He kept a Bible beside his bunk and was often seen reading late into the night. He received no visitors. No one came bearing letters or prayers. Years passed, and the story slowly faded from the headlines. New scandals emerged, new names filled the news, and the tragedy that had once consumed Milledgeville became a footnote in the annals of small-town heartbreak. Yet for those who had lived through it, who had trusted, loved, or followed Harold, forgetting was never truly possible. To some, Harold Mays remained a fallen preacher, a man corrupted by fear and secrecy. To others, he became a symbol of what happens when shame outweighs truth, when power cloaks vulnerability in silence. But to Lamont's family, and to the few who remembered his laughter, his voice, and his unwavering kindness, he was never a symbol. He was simply a son, a friend, a man who deserved more than the ending he received. In the end, the tragedy was not just in the act itself, but in all that came before, the years of hiding, the failure to speak, the choices made in the shadows. And while courts delivered justice, and sentences were served, no verdict could restore what was lost. No punishment could rewrite what had already been done. The prayers offered in that church for healing, for protection, for truth, were never answered. Or perhaps, they were answered in the only way they could be, through loss, through revelation, and through the sobering silence that follows when even the righteous fall.